I'm Mattea Roach, and this is Bookends, CBC's brand new book show. Today on the show, I'm talking to Canadian writer Heather O'Neill. She's here to discuss her latest novel, The Capital of Dreams. Have you ever had the experience of being repeatedly badgered by a friend to give the work of a certain author a shot? I have had this experience, for sure. I've practically been chased out of one of my friend's apartments before with her brandishing a copy of one specific author's book and saying, "You've got to read this." Well, that author for me was Heather O'Neill. Good news, I have finally read Heather O'Neill's work. You were right, it's amazing. Heather is an icon in Canadian literature who has won tons of awards in her career. Her previous books include Lullabies for Little Criminals, The Girl Who Was Saturday Night, and When We Lost Our Heads, which is the book that I was being chased around with. And now Heather has a new novel out called The Capital of Dreams. The Capital of Dreams is about the influence of art and literature on our lives, and it talks about this by telling us the story of Sophia, a 14-year-old girl who's hunting for her mother's lost manuscript amidst the chaos of war. Sophia is not just grappling with the society in turmoil, she's also dealing with the typical personal turmoil of being a teenage girl, horrific stuff for anyone who's gone through it. And I wanted to talk with Heather about what inspired her to create this character of Sophia and what inspired her to develop this relationship between Sophia and her real intellectual mother. So to chat about that, I got Heather to join me from the CBC studios in Montreal. So The Capital of Dreams definitely celebrates arts and literature. We have the story starting in the occupied capital city of Elysia, so this fictional place. What's this place like for folks that haven't read this book yet?
Elysia was an imaginary country that I created, a European country, and it's after the First World War, when all these borders were being kind of redrawn in Europe. And at the time in history, there were so many discussions about nationhood and what makes an identity. Is it language? Is it a religion? Is it common beliefs? And for Elysia, they really decided that they were going to be this country that was identified as an artistic country. And it's really seen as sort of the pinnacle of society when you're at a place where you have people who are able to reflect and think about humanity and engage in these pursuits. So they start to just invest everything into this artistic culture, and they will be recognized by the rest of Europe as having this very distinct identity. For me, it was kind of wonderful, too, because it was almost a country that I wanted to live in as a child, where just the arts were important, because all I liked doing as a child was sort of participating in arts and reading and acting. There's no quality of life without a rich culture that people can participate in and share songs and tell stories.
The pre-war Elysian scene really made me think of Weimar-era Germany, right? Where you're describing that there's these circles of intellectuals. There was the Frankfurt School. There was Walter Benjamin was writing at that time. So much of it was lost with the ascent of fascism and with war and everything. I don't know. It just made me think about all of that.
Definitely the Weimar Republic and the art scene there was a huge influence on my writing, on this novel particularly, because also there's so much that was happening in that time that I adore in art itself. And for me, the setting of it was actually inspired by my father. He couldn't really read or write. He had dyslexia, so at the time he just left school at grade 3. But he was this magical oral storyteller, and he raised me by himself, and he was like this tough gangster guy. But he would always, at night, tell me the most ludicrous tales about his life or people in his life. And so it was always, whenever I asked about the war, it was either him or one of his brothers in the most peculiar situation. And they were very childish stories. They kept meeting magical beings or trolls who would shoot them, or, these incredible women who would just hide them and sing them songs. So it was all kind of make-believe, but I would follow this map, the map of what I imagined as a child with my dad telling me the story about him and his uncles in the war. was sort of the landscape that I originally created for the novel. And then I built like a country around it to have some sort of explanation of where they all were.
Mm-hmm. There's so much richness there. And also just sort of character of an old guy storyteller. My grandfather's the same way. He was never in any war, but he did travel a lot as a young man. And then, you come back and you can tell kids all these stories and no one has any idea how to determine what's real and what's fake.
Oh, I know. That's one of the things I dislike about the information age, how it has kind of taken away that you can't lie in the same way. And I think that was so much part of raising children. You would just create this persona for yourself. You have your own failings, but your children, you sit there and you tell them these marvelous adventures of which you are the hero of this great mythology. And I think that's so important to children because through those stories, you're also imparting your values to them and the metaphors that you think are important.
So speaking of storytelling, like storytelling is so important to the characters in this novel. At the beginning of The Capital of Dreams, we meet Sophia and she's 14 years old. She's our protagonist. We're seeing the world through her eyes. But we also meet her mom, who is at the very center of the art world in Elysia. And she's one of the enemy country's absolute most wanted. So why is Clara, Sophia's mom, so important and dangerous from the enemy's eyes?
Well, she really kind of represented a Simone de Beauvoir type for me. And one of the inspirations, like when I was creating her character, I was like, what would it be like if Simone de Beauvoir actually had a child she had to raise? Because she had been so vocal about not wanting children. And also she had said, you can't be an existentialist if you have a child. And so I was like, well, what if she ended up with a child? Like, what would that sort of relationship be like? But Clara Bottom, for me, was such a wonderful character because she's so vocal about feminist rights and she's sort of the first, famous feminist in her country. Her views are so progressive and wild, and her idea of what a woman is so contrary to the enemy country who's coming to occupy them, who is very conservative. So she becomes one of the people on their most wanted list. But one of the things I love about Clara is that she just adores the fact that she is the most wanted one because she has such an incredibly healthy, grandiose ego. Like when she talks about herself, that was part of the novel where I was actually laughing when I wrote it. I mean, as an artist, you're always supposed to be humble, but writers actually at home and to themselves are it's such a narcissistic act, the idea that your thoughts are so important. You must share them with as many people as possible in this world. And so it takes a huge amount of arrogance. So Sophia, although the rest of the world doesn't see this part of Clara, she just watches Clara at home like her mother, just waxing poetic on her own successes and grandeur, even though for her daughter, it is obviously incredibly obnoxious at times.
Yeah, the Simone de Beauvoir analogy is really interesting to me because de Beauvoir and Sartre and all these other French existentialists all also lived through a war and were present for the German occupation of Paris. And their art was really important as a form of resistance. Was that something you were thinking about when you were writing?
Yeah, Simone de Beauvoir and Samuel Beckett was also a very large influence on this book. A lot of them were writing underground, and it's like their art, even though some of it couldn't be published during the war, the art itself began to speak to the fact that there was this enormous trauma that had happened. And that was one of the reasons I've always liked absurdist plays. There's something in the language that speaks to trauma. And I remember first discovering Waiting for Godot when I was 12. And I think because I had gone through so much trauma by that age, and there was something about the brokenness of the language and the throwing in of ideas and the absurdity and the pointlessness. It spoke to me as a child. And then one of the ideas I was thinking about a lot when I started writing this book was, how do children express trauma, or how do you even describe abuse when you haven't been given the language for it? I lived with my mother, and when I was 7 years old, she sent me to live to Montreal and just basically never to see her again. She just abandoned me and sent me to live with my father, who I didn't know. And he was so rough and abusive, and would have these, I have all these wonderful tales about him, but he would also have these violent rages. But then how do I even speak about it? I was thrown into this world, but I didn't have language to articulate it. All I had was the language of fairy tales and talking lions and the metaphors of elves. So I like the sort of experience of, Sophia trying to find a language that she can express the trauma of what's happening. And I was using absurdist plays because they also always treat the idea, how does one go about life when you just know these horrible things have happened? How do you even, mop the floor without weeping?
A couple years ago, you wrote this essay, Light Bright Times Square, about you balancing your ambitions as a writer with also being a mother. And I guess I want to know maybe more about that, because you've spoken a bit about your parents, but you also became a mother quite young and experienced like a lot of challenges there. What was it like, I guess, navigating raising a child while also trying to pursue a career as a writer and kind of living out, I guess, in many ways, the tension that Clara experiences in this book?
So because I had a mother who essentially abandoned me because they said they wanted to go and work on their art to be a great artist, and you couldn't do this with a child. So that was also in my head. And I read Simone de Beauvoir and I was in university and I thought motherhood was so incompatible with a certain type of creativity and intellectual life. But nonetheless, I had this child. And it was kind of wonderful to deal with that. And it was so confusing in a way, but I was like, I have to not abandon my high intellectual pursuits. I had just graduated from McGill and I had studied literature and theater, and I had all these really sophisticated ideas, probably more sophisticated than I have now, as one does when one's young coming out of university. Like your brain it's a high wire act. But then I had this baby, so we kind of navigated it together, and I was so young. And so there was this sort of back and forth where with everything, I was like, I just can't do all this baby stuff. Like, let's just choose. Like, we'll do one activity for you and one activity for me. So I remember like one afternoon we spent the day in Washington Square Park in the playground. And then at night we went to see a Samuel Beckett play. And then she was little and she was just like, I just have one question. I was like, shh, what? She's like, why are the grandparents in a garbage can? I'm like, it's a metaphor. She's like, okay. But then it really having that, then I always sort of say that somehow my writing ended up being like a cross between Dr. Seuss and Jean Genet, because I had these parallel preoccupations where at night I would just be exploring like the idea of transgressive writing, which really appealed to me, and the idea of turning like filth into something marvelous. And that's where the great art comes from. This was something I really believed. And then I had this little girl who was like, okay, shall we play fairies in the park? And I'm like, certainly, let's go. So it added this almost natural fairy tale kind of strange subtext. And that kind of stayed in my work. And I've always really liked that sort of play between childhood and these great injustices.
To what extent, I guess, did that influence the way that you wrote this relationship between Sophia and Clara in this book versus like when I hear you talk about your experience with your mother, where your mother kind of, there's this view of having a child as a burden that stops you from self-actualization. That seems to me kind of more like what Clara sees having a kid as in this book. How did these two very different experiences of a mother and daughter relationship manifest in your work?
Like everything kind of goes in there. So Clara's not that invested a mother. She just has someone else raising Sophia, and she is constantly critical. That was so much the feeling I had, like what I remembered from my mother, like that I hadn't felt loved at all. And I felt that she thought I was an unworthy companion in life, and she had just rejected me for not being, I don't know, cool or edgy or, whatever. I mean, I was 7. I couldn't really participate in the artistic milieu of New York or wherever she wanted to go. It was different times. She was also gay. That was part of her. And she had come out after she had me. There was just so many sort of strange ways that I didn't fit into her idea of what a woman was. And you couldn't ever even be open about being critical about the idea of motherhood or having regrets or disliking it. So perhaps if it was a different time, she might have navigated it differently. But I mean, I doubt it. She was always going to leave me. But I feel that Clara is different than my mother because Clara actually is sort of doing her best to raise her.
Mm-hmm. I know your previous novels, a lot of them centered on sort of the motherless child figure, similar to what we see in a lot of fairy tales, right? Where kids are orphans or they're otherwise abandoned, or there's some sort of reason why the mother's not in the picture. And this is the first time you've actually had a mother figure in one of your novels. I guess I'm wondering, is there a reason why you felt moved to include that kind of a character at this point in your life and at this point in your career as a writer?
It's strange because I don't always think about what the book is going to be. It just, I work on it and it builds itself. And I remember I handed in The Lonely Hearts Hotel to my editor and she said, it's another book with motherless children. And I was like, oh, not again. I forgot the mothers. I was like, note to myself, like, put a mother in once in a while. But actually, Clara, it's funny because sometimes I put these characters in the book and I want them to be secondary, but they absolutely refuse to be secondary characters in any way. And they just become bigger and bigger. And part of creating Clara was also that I had never had any middle-aged women in my book or older women. And because, I was moving up towards 50 and I'm 50 now. And it's just this major time of renaissance and power for women. And I just wanted a character who kind of embodied that, like a woman who just owns coming into her age and has all these accomplishments. And she's just so proud of them.
The character that we see, I would say the next most often to Sophia in this book, though, is actually this talking goose. Mm-hmm. So Sophia, she boards this children's train that's supposed to take Elysian children out of the country, kind of giving like kinder transport vibes, or when English children were sent out of London during the Blitz, like was what it reminded me of. Mm-hmm. This train is actually a trap and she escapes, but she loses this manuscript and then she befriends this talking goose. I saw myself in this goose. I was like, this goose was me when I was a teenager. Like, I just wanted to get out of home and make something of myself.
Oh, yeah. The goose is like, it's hilarious. It just, for me, it was the way that, teenage children, when they try and talk about philosophical ideas, and it's almost like I remember as a teenager, you kind of have to go away from adults because they're just like, what are you guys? No. And it's like, leave us alone, okay? We're going to play at being intelligent over here and discuss this book or whatever idea. And you know what it was also? It was the level of playfulness of the way the goose engages with philosophical ideas was something that I had been inspired by Samuel Beckett and Simone de Beauvoir. And then while researching, I found out they lived on the same street in Paris in their later years and just hated each other's guts. Just fought all the time, couldn't bear the sight of each other. And I was like, oh, that's so funny. Those two contradictory characteristics, and I put them into one character. And it's like, of course, he's like always wild and like angry and funny, but also touching, like the fact he's always insecure when people talk about swans, because swans are sort of more metaphorical and swans end up in poetry, but he's a goose, so he has these highfalutin ideas about himself, and yet he's associated with domesticity and farm animals. And there's something sometimes when people who have these great egos and they're obnoxious, but you can't bear to see them broken because it's so like, oh, I don't want to see their charade. I don't want to pull the curtains on my friend who's the wizard.
It's like the fact that they're kind of so proud of themselves makes it so much worse to see them fall, right? Because it's such a farther way to fall.
It's so unbearable.
Yeah. It's funny, like, I now talk with my friends, we're all like 25, and all of us are like, have we become stupider since we were teenagers? Because we feel so much less sure of our own intellect. And I think actually the answer is that teenagers are very full of themselves because they're thinking for the first time and they haven't read enough to realize that other people have already had these thoughts. And so they think they're so brilliant. And I feel like Sophia and the goose are both the goose really embodied that for me. And it's like a philosophical laboratory on the road with those two.
Yeah, the two of them, it's like they're the first beings that take one another seriously, no matter how crazy.
Yeah. This isn't your only work that incorporates these kinds of themes. I would say that the fantastic and sort of this magical realism permeates a lot of your previous work as well. Is there anything that you feel draws you in particular to these stories beyond just the fact that they permeate our culture? And I think a lot of people grow up, hearing fairy tales or having these sort of storybook collections.
At some point, the older I get, the more I just believe in magical things and that animals can talk and that there are fairies hiding under the table and doing, different services for me. So I don't know, maybe I'm just going mad as I get older. But there's more magic within my works because my belief in it just has become stronger and stronger, where one would think as getting older you would believe less in magic. But the older I get, I'm like, I just believe in everything now.
So we see that by the end of the war, the enemy hasn't wiped out Elysian art and culture. It sort of still lives in these oral traditions and in the memory of people in the country. What do you think Sophia believes or maybe realizes about the nature of art and of good, impactful art by the end of this book?
The fact that, it does change and there's things that evolve. And I think it's just this idea that I think it's the voice of the people. I was reading a story in the Warsaw Ghetto right before it was liquidated that people were hiding their stories, and they were writing little stories and would hide them so that after the war someone might dig them up and find them. And years later they started finding these little stories in bricks. Sophia sees herself as, even in exile, even without the mother's manuscript, she's still the seed of Elysia or whatever it was, and wherever she plants it herself, all those ideas will spread and affect the other art around it.
Yeah, there's this sort of expression, I think, at the end of the value of you have the high culture represented by Clara. You have folk culture, the oral history, the fairy tales, the amateur art, right? Sophia is like a clarinet player, and she says, I maybe don't remember these songs exactly perfectly, but now the sort of errors that I make are just going to become part of the song because it's how I remember it, and that's how the culture is living. And I think that that's very beautiful and so important.
Oh, yes. I like art that's not perfect. I like that it's, broken. I like that someone can't properly play the clarinet. There was a line in a Nouvelle Vague film where they're listening to an imitation of a singer who's imitating Marlene Dietrich, and the character says, the imitators are always actually better, but they don't have the baggage. And it's something about the baggage of artists and countries and people that make art so wonderful.
What a beautiful note to end this on. I love where we kind of left this conversation. Thank you so much for joining me, Heather.
Thank you.
That was Heather O'Neill. Her latest novel is called The Capital of Dreams. This show was produced by Lisa Matthews. Our senior producer is Jacqueline Kirk, and our executive producer is Aaron Balser. I also want to thank our tech, Laura Antonelli, and the entire CBC Books team for making this show happen every week. You can catch Bookends on Sundays and Wednesdays on CBC Radio or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Because when the book ends, the conversation begins.